I'm going to read the speech of Miss Polly Baker. As I read, I'd like you to think about the RAVEN acronym. In other words, what do you think the reliability or the biases are of the person speaking? And then we're going to talk about rhetorical strategies. You might have your rhetorical guide in front of you, or you might just be taking freehand notes. But think about the audience and the way that she's trying to convince that audience. She uses a lot of strategies. Let me give you a little bit of background. The speech of Miss Polly Baker before a court of judicature at Connecticut near Boston in New England, where she was prosecuted the 5th time for having a bastard child, which influenced the court to dispense with her punishment and induced one of her judges to marry her the next day. In other words, 5 times she'd been brought to the court for having a child without being married, which was against the law at that time, and her speech was so good that not only did they get rid of her punishment, one of the judges asked to marry her the next day. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read the speech. May it please the honorable bench to indulge me in a few words. I am a poor, unhappy woman who have no money to fee lawyers to plead for me, being hard put to it to get a tolerable living. I shall not trouble your honors with long speeches, for I have not the presumption to expect that you may by any means be prevailed on to deviate in your sentence from the law. In my favor, all I humbly hope is that your honors would charitably move the governor's goodness on my behalf, that my fine may be remitted. This is the 5th time, gentlemen, that I've been dragged before your court on the same account. Twice I have paid heavy fines, and twice have been brought to public punishment for want of money to pay those fines. This may have been agreeable to the laws, and I don't dispute it, but since laws are sometimes unreasonable in themselves, and therefore repealed, and others bear too hard on the subject in particular circumstances, and therefore there is left a power somewhat to dispense with the execution of them, I take the liberty to say that I think this law, by which I am punished, is both unreasonable in itself and particularly severe with regard to me, who have always lived an inoffensive life in the neighborhood where I was born, and defy my enemies, if I have any, to say I ever wronged man, woman, or child. Abstracted from the law, I cannot conceive, may it please your honors, what the nature of my offense is. I have brought 5 fine children into the world. At the risk of my life, I have maintained them well by my own industry, without burdening the township, and would have done it better if not for the heavy charges and fines I have paid. Can it be a crime in the nature of things I mean, to add to the number of the king's subjects in a new country that really wants people? I own it, I should think it a praiseworthy rather than a punishable action. I have debauched no other woman's husband, nor enticed any youth. These things I never was charged with, nor was any of the least cause of complaint against me, unless perhaps the minister or justice, because I have had children without being married, by which they missed a wedding fee. But can ever this be a fault of mine? I appeal to your honors. You are pleased to allow I don't want sense, but I must be stupefied to the last degree, not to prefer the honorable state of wedlock to the condition I have lived in. I always was, and still am willing to enter it, and doubt not my behaving well in it, having all the industry, frugality, fertility, and skill and economy appertaining to a good wife's character. I defy any person to say I ever refused an offer of that sort. On the contrary, I readily consented to the only proposal of marriage that ever was made me, which was when I was a virgin, but too easily confiding in the person's sincerity that made it, I unhappily lost my own honor by trusting to his, for he got me with child and then forsook me. That very person you all know, he is now become a magistrate of this country, and I had hopes he would have appeared this day on the bench, and have endeavored to moderate the court in my favor. Then I should have scorned to have mentioned it, but I must now complain of it as unjust and unequal, that my betrayer and undoer, the first cause of all my faults and miscarriages, if they must be deemed such, should be advanced to honor and power in the government, that punishes my misfortunes with stripes and infamy. I should be told 'tis like there was no act of assembly in the case. The precepts of religion are violated by my transgressions. If mine then is a religious offense, leave it to religious punishments. You have already excluded me from the comforts of your church, communion. Is that not sufficient? You believe I have offended heaven and must suffer eternal fire. Will not that be sufficient? What need is there then of your additional fines and whipping? I own I do not think as you do, for if I thought what you call a sin was really such, I could not presumptuously commit it. But how can it be believed that heaven is angry at my having children, when to the little done by me towards it God has been pleased to add his divine skill and admirable workmanship in the formation of their bodies, and crowned it by furnishing them with rational and immortal souls? Forgive me, gentlemen, if I talk a little extravagantly on these matters. I am no divine. But if you, gentlemen, must be making laws, do not turn natural and useful actions into crimes by your prohibitions. But take into your wise consideration the great and growing number of bachelors in the country, many of whom, from the mean fear of the expenses of a family, have never sincerely and honorably courted a woman in their lives, and by their manner of living leave unproduced, which is little better than murder, hundreds of their posterity to the 1000th generation. Is not this a greater offense against the public good than mine? Compel them then by law either to marriage or to pay double the fine of fornication every year. What must poor young women do, whom custom have forbid to solicit the men, and who cannot force themselves upon husbands, when the laws take no care to provide them any, and yet severely punish them if they do their duty without them, the duty of the first and great command of nature and of nature's God, increase and multiply, a duty from the steady performance of which nothing has been able to deter me, but for its sake I have hazarded the loss of public esteem, and have frequently endured public disgrace and punishment, and therefore ought, in my humble opinion, instead of a whipping, to have a statue erected to my memory. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. I'm just going to take a few minutes, and I'd like to talk about each section. If you were taking notes or want to catch up on notes, you might want to pause for a minute. If not, you can just kind of carry along with me. First, obviously, using the first person at the beginning and defining herself as, I am a poor and unhappy woman who have no money to fee lawyers, she's explaining why she's defending herself. She uses first person continuously throughout the piece because she is the expert. She is the witness to this. Just to summarize, in case you missed some of the finer points of the essay, essentially 5 times she's been brought to court. Either she's had to pay a fine for having a child out of wedlock, or she's been whipped publicly. And essentially, this is sort of her last stand. She's saying, wait a minute, what am I doing wrong? Let's talk about it from different angles. She then proceeds to complete her argument in a variety of different ways. First, she talks about the law, and she talks about the power of it. Then, as she continues, she talks about the idea that in this new country, they want more subjects. So isn't she in fact doing what is good for the country? So again, we've gone from what is defined by law to what is defined for the good of the country. Then she speaks to the idea that her situation is actually not entirely her fault. She certainly admits that she's had 5 children, but she discusses the fact that the first man to propose to her then walked away, and now he's held in esteem in the government, while she is for the 5th time brought up into the court. This shows a huge inequity between how men and women were treated in this instance. And keep in mind, too, this was a time where it would be very difficult to prove who the father of a child out of wedlock was, where obviously it's very easy to tell the mother. Then she moves to the idea of it being a religious offense. If the court is trying to claim that it's a sin and a religious offense, do they really have the right to punish her? Should not this be something that a church deals with? And finally, she defines her own opinion. And I think it's important that she leaves this here, because instead of starting with "this is my opinion," she builds her case on the legality, on patriotism, on religion. And then she explains that she would not do something knowingly. She also points out earlier in the piece that none of the people that she's had relations with to have these children are married or underage. She's not offended anyone else in doing these things. And then at the end, she has a great question here, and she has a lot of really strong rhetorical questions throughout, or rhetorical statements as well. What must poor young women do, whom custom have forbid to solicit the men, and who cannot force themselves upon husbands? In other words, when she talks about there being more and more bachelors in the country, she's saying that this system essentially encourages men not to have to worry about being married because the women are the ones who are punished. And then in a very strong statement at the end, she says, wait a minute, instead of a public whipping, perhaps a statue should be made for me because I am doing all of these positive things that you've deemed bad. So this is, again, a really, really strong example of building an argument. And if we're going to look at the RAVEN acronym and look at her, she is absolutely an expert, but she also is very biased because she has gone through the situation multiple times. That being said, her voice carries weight. And the interesting thing about this is that it's not a she at all. This essay was not written by Polly Baker. Polly Baker did not exist. Instead, it was written by Benjamin Franklin. And I always think that's a really interesting thing, so I'm sorry that we don't get to talk about it in person, and I don't get to see some looks of surprise. Some of you may have known that already going in, hopefully not too many. But he wanted to write about how unfair he felt the system was. But instead, he wrote from the point of view of Polly Baker, a woman who was in the system. Of course, Benjamin Franklin carried a lot of weight as a politician and a speech person. However, he had not been in the system in this way. Would he really have the authority to speak for unwed women? Not so much. So it's very interesting that he got this published and it was circulated widely before people discovered that it was Benjamin Franklin. Still was taken seriously, but I would argue that the skill that's used in the argument is because he was such a good spokesperson and because he had so often made arguments in other realms that he really understood how to use the evidence. So again, I think this is an excellent one if we're looking at that idea of RAVEN and bias. Yes, she's biased, but her expertise would outweigh that bias if Miss Polly Baker were in fact a person and it wasn't just Benjamin Franklin exercising his writing muscles. So you have to weigh bias with facts and figures and argument. Can you be biased but still create a really strong argument? Absolutely. But as readers, we just need to acknowledge the bias. Now take a minute and please head to the discussion board posted after this.